Hello dear students. In today's class we will understand second part of an interesting play, The Collectors. 6 students and 3 teachers were out for an adventure walk. Students, do you remember their names? Yes. Students are Pete, Carol, Tracy, Glenn, Wayne, Don. Teachers are Mr. Hunt, Miss Swan, Mrs. Johns. As it was raining heavily and the children were wet and cold, they decided to approach the house in a lonely place for shelter. We'll continue. Please open your textbook, students, page number 45. I am going to read the next part, scene inside the kitchen of the house. Scene inside the kitchen of the house. Mrs. Brown is standing with all the children and teachers. Mr. Brown comes in through the outer door. Mr. Brown, I have hung up all the wet clothing in the porch. Mr. Hunt, I don't know why I am still holding this walking stick. Mr. Brown, give it to me. I'll put it outside with the other things. Mr. Hunt, it's all right. I will hang it on the back of this chair. Mrs. Brown, now that we have all introduced ourselves, why don't you children sit down? Mr. Brown, and the grown-ups can come through into the sitting room. Mrs. Brown, you children will be all right here, won't you? There isn't room enough there for everyone. Carol, yes, thanks. Glenn, oh, yes. Pete, we will be fine. Mrs. Johns, thank you very much for taking us in like this. Mr. Brown, our pleasure. Mrs. Brown, there is a fresh pot of tea made in the other room. Would you like a cup? Miss Swan, I would love one. Mrs. Johns, so would I. Mrs. Brown, would you like to come through then? Porch means covered entrance or portico. Moving on to the explanation. The teachers and the students are welcomed by the inmates of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Everyone are inside the kitchen of the house. Mr. Brown gets inside the kitchen saying that their wet clothes are hung in the porch and they could relax. The occupants of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, asked the children to sit in the kitchen and asked the teachers to sit in the living room as there wasn't enough place in the living room for all. And the teachers are also offered tea. Moving on to the next part, page number 46. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and the 3 teachers go out. The children are silent for a moment or two, looking round. Wayne, you can't hear any sound of that wind in here. Tracy, no, it's terribly quiet, weird. Don, I can just hear their voices in the sitting room. Glenn, it's cold in here too. Wayne, maybe we feel cold because we are tired from all that walking. Tracy, and we did get wet. Glenn, no, not just that. It is cold. Pete, and empty. This kitchen reminds me of a hospital. Where do they wash up? Don, in the sink. Tracy, or the washing up machine? Pete, there is nothing like that. Carol, there is nothing standing about either. No plates, no pots and pans, things like that. Don, they'll put away in cupboards. Wayne opens a cupboard near the back door. Wayne, this one is quite empty. Don, don't go poking about, Wayne. Pete opens the fridge door. Pete, there is nothing at all in this fridge, and the light's not on. It's not even working. Tracy, leave things alone, you too. It's cheeky to snoop. Besides, they might come in and catch you. Carol, I thought there was something a bit strange about Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Pete, funny, you should say that. So did I. Glenn, perhaps they are crooks. This is their hideout. Tracy, they would hardly have let us in if they were crooks, would they? Don, no, that's silly. Carol, maybe we ought to have gone on walking to the village. Don, we would have got drenched. Meanings of new words: weird, strange or unusual. Poking, to look around or search through something. Cheeky, disrespectful. Snoop, poke around. Crook, a person who is dishonest or criminal. Hideout, a hiding place, especially one used by someone who has broken the law. Drench, wet thoroughly or soaked. Moving on to the explanation. Mr. and Mrs. Brown and the three teachers went to the sitting room. Children in the kitchen felt uncomfortable. They find the house to be strange, as it is terribly quiet and cold, and there was no wind at all. The kitchen looked very empty. There were no plates, pots, and pans. The children wonder whether the Browns have put all their things in the cupboard. Wayne opened a cupboard, and Pete opened a fridge. The cupboards were empty, and the fridge was also empty, and it was not switched on. Don and Tracy warned Wayne and Pete not to snoop around. At that time, Carol remarked that there was something a bit strange about Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Finally, the children came to the conclusion that the Browns are crooks and the house is their hideout. Students, I have already told you the meaning of the word crook. A person who is dishonest or criminal. And hideout is a hiding place. Children thought that the Browns are crooks and the house was their hideout. Dear students, in today's class we have understood second part of an interesting play, The Collectors. Let me ask you few questions. First one, what is the meaning of the word porch? Yes, the meaning of the word porch is covered entrance or portico. Second one, name the occupants of the house. The occupants of the house are Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown. Next one, list the things that made the children feel uncomfortable in the kitchen. The kitchen is like a hospital. No plates, no pots and pans. The cupboard is quite empty. The fridge is also empty. These are the 4 points which made the children feel uncomfortable in the kitchen. I hope you all have answered correctly. Now I am going to end up the class. Bye for now. Thank you. Have a nice day.